All right, take a look at this. It's just a beaker of cloudy water, right? Seems simple, maybe even a little boring. But what if I told you that locked inside this beaker are some of the fundamental secrets of chemical energy just waiting for us to uncover them? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do.
So, think of this as a scientific investigation. Our mission? To decode the thermodynamic clues hidden in plain sight. We're going to try and measure the invisible forces of heat and disorder that control this whole process, and see how they battle it out for dominance.
Now, our main subject is this white powder, magnesium hydroxide. You might actually know it as the active ingredient in milk of magnesia, but the key property for our investigation is that it's sparingly soluble. That's really just a chemist's way of saying it doesn't like to dissolve in water very much. And that is why the water stays cloudy.
And this right here is the process we're putting under the microscope. The solid magnesium hydroxide is in this constant tug of war, a chemical equilibrium. A tiny bit of it breaks apart into magnesium and hydroxide ions in the water. And at the same time, those ions are constantly reforming back into the solid. It's a two-way street.
So, to measure this tug of war, we use a value called KSP, the solubility product constant. You can just think of it as a score that tells us exactly how much of the solid has dissolved when the water can't possibly hold any more. And here's the really interesting part. That KSP value changes with temperature. And that, my friends, is the central clue in our mystery. So, how do we actually find these clues? Well, we have to get our hands dirty and run an experiment. This is the part where we collect the raw evidence that will, eventually, reveal all the thermodynamic secrets we're after. And here's our toolkit. It's actually surprisingly simple. We've got a beaker for our cloudy water, a hot plate to change the temperature, a pH probe to indirectly measure what's going on, and a thermometer. Believe it or not, that is all we need to crack this case.
Okay, a quick but important word of warning, straight from the lab manual. Even simple experiments like this demand respect. Magnesium hydroxide is a caustic solid, so it's not something you'd want to be careless with. It just adds a little bit of real-world gravity to our investigation, you know? The procedure itself is pretty straightforward. First, we make our cloudy, saturated solution, and we let it reach that equilibrium we talked about. Then, we record the temperature and the pH. Next, we gently heat it up a bit, let the new equilibrium settle in, and record the data again. We're going to repeat this whole process until we have 6 sets of data points, 6 crucial pieces of evidence.
All right, we've collected our evidence. But right now, it's really just a list of numbers. To make any sense of them, we need to do some, let's call it chemical forensics. It's time to decode the data. So this is what we have to work with. A simple table of temperatures and their matching pH values. These are our raw clues. But on their own, they don't really tell us much about things like enthalpy or entropy. We need to transform them. Let's start with our graph's x-axis. We can't just use the temperature in Celsius. For this to work, we need to convert it to Kelvin, that's the absolute temperature scale, and then take the inverse of that number. It sounds a little weird, I know, but this specific trick is what's going to help us turn a complex curve into a simple, straight line we can analyze. Now the y-axis, that's a bit more involved, but it's a really cool chain of logic. We're basically taking our simple pH reading and working backwards. From pH, we can figure out the concentration of hydroxide ions, and from there, the concentration of magnesium ions. That lets us calculate our key value, KSP, and then we just do one last little tweak to get it ready for our final graph. Each step gets us closer to the big picture. And hey, here's a little pro tip from the lab. Sometimes those first data points, the ones at colder temperatures, can be a little shaky. That's just because the reaction takes a really long time to settle down when it's cold. So if they don't seem to fit the trend, it's totally okay for an investigator to focus on the more reliable data from the warmer temperatures.
And now, for the moment we've all been waiting for. We've gathered our clues, we've decoded them, and now we are ready to put them all together on one single graph that is going to reveal everything. This, folks, is the big reveal.
Do you remember this old friend from math class, the simple equation for a straight line? I know, it might seem super basic, but it turns out this little equation is the master key that's going to unlock our entire thermodynamic mystery. And boom, here it is. This is the Van't Hoff equation. Just look at how perfectly it maps onto y equals mx plus b. Our y value is the ln of k we calculated. Our x value is that 1 over t. And that means the slope of our line, m, is that whole term with delta h, the enthalpy. And the y-intercept, b, well, that's the term with delta s, the entropy. It's all right there, hidden in plain sight inside the equation for a simple line.
So here's the bottom line. Once we plot our data and get the equation for that line, we can solve for those two secret values. The slope tells us the heat of the reaction, delta H, and the intercept tells us the change in disorder, delta S. Just like that, we've found them.
Of course, to do the final math, we just need one last piece of the puzzle, the ideal gas constant, which we call R. It's just a universal number that helps connect all of these thermodynamic properties together.
Okay, we did it. We've actually calculated delta H and delta S. But what do these numbers really mean? What's the final verdict from our investigation into this simple, cloudy water? Well, let's think about the signs, whether they're positive or negative. For this reaction, we typically find a positive delta H, which means it needs to absorb heat to happen, and that's generally unfavorable. But we also find a positive delta S, which means things get more disordered, and that is favorable. It's a classic thermodynamic battle between heat and chaos. So that leads to a really practical question. Based on our findings, would we expect more of this stuff to dissolve in cold water or in hot water? Well, the data gives us a clear answer. Since the reaction needs to absorb heat to go forward, heating it up helps it along. So we definitely expect more of it to dissolve in hot water. We're basically giving the reaction the energy it's asking for.
And you know, this is the ultimate power of what we've just done. Because we have delta H and delta S, we can now calculate something called the Gibbs free energy, or delta G, for any temperature we can imagine. And delta G is the final decider. It tells us, point blank, whether the dissolving process will happen on its own.
For example, we could plug in the numbers for near freezing water at 5 degrees Celsius and then do it again for near boiling water at 95 degrees. We can now predict, without even running the experiment, exactly how the reaction is going to behave. That's the real predictive power of thermodynamics. So, think about it. We started with just a simple glass of cloudy water, and using a few basic tools, we managed to measure the invisible forces of enthalpy and entropy that control it from behind the scenes. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other unseen chemical secrets are hiding out there in plain sight, just waiting for us to investigate?